But the bottom line is, don't you think this rather sacred weekend, it's disrespectful for anyone to go on a march other than to remember the war dead? It's about the timing. They can go on Friday, they can go on Monday, but not Armistice Day, not Remembrance Sunday.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of this Ziontology series. In the last episode, I looked at the outbreak of gratuitous violence at the end of the 1920s, and how that shaped the nature of the Zionist project ever after. In this episode, I'm going to run through the events of the 1930s, where Palestinian Arabs came to resist the Zionist incursion in a far more coordinated manner, and how that resistance would ultimately be crushed by the might of the British Empire. To set the stage, Jewish immigration into Palestine drastically increased in 1933 due to the emergence of the Nazis in Germany. With the door of Britain and the United States remaining firmly closed, Palestine was one of the only places that offered hope to Jewish refugees. Between the years 1929 to 33, Jewish immigration stood somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people annually. This went up to 9,500 in 1932, 30,000 in 1933, 42,000 in 1934, and 62,000 in 1935. That was the peak year, but by 1939 there were 460,000 Jews in Palestine, up from 175,000 in 1929 and just 60,000 in 1918. Due to high birth rates, the Arab population also increased during this period, surpassing 1 million people, but declined as a percentage. Jews increased from 10% in 1918 to 20% by 1929 to over 30% by 1939. Once again, to get a sense of what this must have been like for a Palestinian, imagine an ethnic group going from a small and harmless minority to suddenly constituting almost 1/3 of the population of your country. This is whilst they overtly proclaim their agenda to take over. Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion wrote, quote, "Were I an Arab, I would rise up against immigration, liable sometime in the future to hand the country over to Jewish rule. What Arab cannot do his math and understand that immigration at a rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all Palestine?" End quote. It is worth remembering Ben-Gurion was a Pole, whose birth name was David Grun, or Green. This immigration drove up land prices and increased the Arab dispossession I've discussed in previous episodes. In 1932, British High Commissioner Sir Arthur Wauchope said that, quote, "A continued increase in the class of landless Arabs was a social peril. There was a risk to the landless Arab class producing economic results which would serve as a focus of discontent and might even result in serious disorders." End quote. The Great Depression took its toll on Palestine, with rural incomes dropping by around 1/3 whilst living costs rose. This situation was exacerbated by a punitive British-imposed tax regime, which, due to the way it was calculated, shot up during the Depression. This drove large numbers of Arab families into severe debt. In the Haifa district, it was estimated that at least one member of nearly 2/3 of peasant families had either been served a warrant of arrest or confiscation on account of debt. Historian Weldon C. Matthews comments that, quote, "It would be difficult for even the most detached observer not to comment that the system of taxation showed an appalling level of exploitation inflicted by a supposedly enlightened administration." End quote. Coming out of the violence of 1929, the Black Hand terrorist group was founded and led by Syrian-born Sheikh Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. Al-Qassam declared a jihad and attacked Jewish settlers, killing around 10 civilians in shootings and bombings. His group consisted of several hundred men operating in small cells, and would also engage in acts of sabotage against British infrastructure, such as railway lines. The British also now became direct targets of violence themselves. Al-Qassam was killed in 1935 during a shootout with the police. He became a martyr for the Palestinian cause, a figure people could unite around. The militant wing of Hamas, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, take their name from him, as do the Qassam rockets which are shot from Gaza into Israel. It is at this time a distinctly Palestinian national identity begins to take shape, one that transcends identification with family and clan. The absence of such an identity had severely hampered unified opposition to the Zionist incursion. Arabs started celebrating Palestine Day and a memorial day for the Battle of Hattin, where 900 years earlier Saladin had defeated the Crusaders in the Holy Land. The British countered the emergence of such an identity through divide and rule tactics. As an example, they created a position titled Grand Mufti of all Palestine in order to have a counterweight to the political movements. The position was given to a member of the elite Husseini family on the promise that he would help to maintain order. This brings us to the 1933 Palestine riots. As a result of the increased levels of immigration, the Arab Executive Committee called for a general strike and a demonstration in Jerusalem. Demonstrations had actually been banned since the riots of 1929. The tactic of striking had been used in Iraq in 1931, seemingly successfully, as they had attained independence from the British the following year. So there was reason to believe this could be a successful strategy. It is also worth noting that this is, in principle at least, a non-violent form of waging war. Gandhi's program of non-cooperation and civil disobedience had been running in India since 1930, and the Palestinian Istiqlal Party was calling for its implementation. The Jerusalem demonstration had some low-level violence leading to injuries. When the demonstration was repeated in Jaffa a few days later, serious violence broke out. 2 policemen were stabbed, and another was killed by having heavy blocks dropped upon him. 26 demonstrators were then shot by the police. One striking feature of the riots is that Jews were, deliberately, not targeted. There was only one attack on them, in Haifa, where they were protected by other Arab demonstrators. A Palestinian politician is quoted as saying, "This time, can you accuse us of directing our movement against the Jews? Did one hair of the Jews fall to the ground? This time, our movement was directed against the mandatory government and not against the Jews." End quote. This level of discipline forced the Zionist movement to recognize Arab nationalism was evolving, with David Ben-Gurion writing, "The Arab community had shown itself to be an organized and disciplined public who present their national will through political maturity and capability of self-evaluation." End quote. In 1935, there was what is known as the cement barrel incident, where 800 rifles and 400 rounds of ammunition were discovered being smuggled into the country by Zionists in a cement barrel. After the 1929 riots, and in response to the formation of groups such as the Black Hand, the Haganah, the Zionist Defense Force, sent operatives to Europe to procure weapons. This was in addition to the domestic industry, reckoned to be producing 100 hand grenades a day. It was also not the first shipment of this nature to be discovered. Irrespective as to whether the Zionists saw these procurements as being purely defensive, they set off unprecedented alarm in the Arab community. The people who proclaim they want to take over your country are now armed to the teeth. Now we come to the event known as the Palestinian Revolution, or Great Palestinian Revolt, which lasted from 1936 to 39. This could be said to start when a band of Al-Qassam's followers murdered 2 Jews in retaliation for his death. A few days later, 2 Arab men were murdered in retaliation for the retaliation, and in retaliation for that, Arabs rioted in Jaffa, killing 9 Jews. A general strike was called, which would last for 6 months and came to include the non-payment of taxes. A newly formed Arab Higher Committee resolved to continue the strike until the British government prohibited further Jewish immigration, prohibited the transfer of Arab land to Jews, and established a national government for Palestine. In addition to the strike, Palestinians engaged in acts of sabotage against railways, bridges, telephone lines, and a newly constructed oil pipeline. They would also target Jewish orchards and are estimated to have destroyed 200,000 trees. In this initial phase, historian Benny Morris writes that, aside from the riot in Jaffa, there were no serious attacks against Jews. I take this to mean no out-and-out massacres like what was seen in 1929, but by the end of the strike, 80 Jews, 28 Britons, and around 200 Arabs had been killed. Just to comment on this, whilst I certainly don't wish to downplay 80 Jewish fatalities, it is worth noting that this is over a 6-month period, so around 3 a week. This is far less than were murdered in just a single day during the massacres of 1929. I'm not sure if this is due to a new and more coordinated Arab strategy which eschewed such violence, or that Jewish communities were now more separated off and taking more precautions to protect themselves. I'll talk about the British and Zionist response to the revolt in a moment, but first I'll address what brought the strike to an end. The strike ended in October of 1936, in part due to economic realities, and also because the British initiated the Peel Commission to address Arab grievances. The Arab Higher Committee issued a proclamation to the leaders of militia bands, reading, quote, "Honoured brethren, heroes, our poor tongues cannot express the strength of our love and admiration and exaltation concealed in our hearts for your self-sacrifice and your devoted war for religion, fatherland, and all things Arab. Rest assured that your struggle is engraved in the letters of flame in the chronicles of the nation. And now, we urge you to stop activity until needed. Save the bullets and take care of them. We stand now in a period of hope and expectation. If the Royal Commission comes and judges equitably and gives us all our rights, well and good. If not, the field of battle lies before us. We request self-control and armistice until a new notice." End quote. The militias did stand down, and there was a period of calm lasting almost a year. The Peel Commission repeated the Arab grievances highlighted in previous British reports, regarding the loss of their land to immigrant Jews. The Commission was generous to the Zionist position, however, asserting that, quote, "Arabs have benefited by the development of the country owing to Jewish immigration. Much of the land now carrying orange groves was sand dunes or swamp and uncultivated when it was purchased. The shortage of land is, we consider, due less to the amount of land acquired by the Jews than to the increase in the Arab population." End quote. The Commission was also, perhaps unsurprisingly, rather generous to the British drafters of the Balfour Declaration, writing that they could not have anticipated the level of Jewish immigration resulting from economic pressures in Poland and the rise of the Nazis in combination with immigration restrictions in the United States. Cynically, one could ask how hard it was to foresee that something really bad was going to happen to the Jews in Europe. The Commission concluded that the situation in Palestine was unworkable, writing that, quote, "An irrepressible conflict has arisen between two national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. There is no common ground between them. Their national aspirations are incompatible. The Arabs desire to revive the traditions of the Arab Golden Age. The Jews desire to show what they can achieve when restored to the land in which the Jewish nation was born. Neither of the two national ideals permits of combination in the service of a single state." End quote. As an interesting aside, Peel identified the problem as starting in the education system, reporting that, quote, "So far, in fact, from facilitating a better understanding between the races, the Jewish educational system is making it more and more difficult as, year by year, its production of eager Jewish nationalists mounts up." End quote. Peel further commented that, quote, "Arab nationalism is as intense a force as Jewish, and like Jewish nationalism, it is stimulated by the educational system and the growth of the youth movement." End quote. The Commission therefore recommended the partition of Palestine into an independent Jewish state alongside an Arab state linked to Transjordan. The Zionists would receive 20% of the land, but as the Arabs pointed out, it was the majority of the cultivatable land, whereas they would be consigned to the barren mountains. Now, here's the real kicker. For this plan to be carried out, it would have required 1,250 Jews and 225,000 Arabs to be transferred, or essentially ethnically cleansed from their homes. Peel writes that, quote, "In the last resort, the exchange would be compulsory." End quote. Of course, if something is compulsory in the last resort, it's compulsory in the first resort too. The Palestinians were understandably shocked by this outcome and saw it as a complete abandonment of every promise that had ever been made to them going back to the First World War. The politician Saeed al-Hadi summed up the Arab position in Churchillian fashion when he said, quote, "We will fight. We will struggle against the partition of the country and against the Jewish immigration. There is no compromise." End quote. For the Zionists, who had been bugging the commissioners' meeting rooms, population transfer had always been a part of their doctrine, going back to Theodor Herzl in his book, The Jewish State. They had kept quiet about this so as not to provoke the Arabs, and, on an individual basis, might even have had some moral qualms against it, but when the British offered it, they were more than willing to accept. It was, after all, basically impossible to achieve a Jewish majority in Palestine in the absence of an ethnic cleansing program. Zionist leader Menachem Usiskin defended the morality of forced transfers and said, quote, "We cannot start the Jewish state with half the population being Arab. Such a state cannot survive even half an hour." End quote. The only objection the Zionists had was with the size of the state being offered. Vladimir Jabotinsky's revisionist party rejected the proposal as they still wanted not only Palestine, but Jordan too. At the other extreme, some members of the Zionist peace movement still believed a binational one-state solution was possible. Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion pushed for the acceptance of the partition, with Weizmann saying, quote, "The Jews would be fools not to accept it, even if the land they were allocated were the size of a tablecloth." End quote. Their difference with the revisionists was merely strategic. They saw the 20% allocation as just the first step in the conquest of all Palestine, with Ben-Gurion writing to his son that, quote, "A Jewish state in part of Palestine is not an end, but a beginning. Our possession is important not only for itself. Through this, we increase our power, and every increase in power facilitates getting hold of the country in its entirety. Establishing a small state will serve as a very potent lever in our historical efforts to redeem the whole country." End quote. With the Arab rejection of the partition plan, the rebellion resumed in September 1937 with the assassination of a British acting district commissioner. The Arab Higher Committee actually condemned the murder, with the Grand Mufti issuing a public call for restraint and non-violence. Some Palestinian leaders believed that a renewed rebellion would do more to hurt their position. The British government actually declared the committee illegal and rounded up and deported its leaders. The revolt then proceeded without any central command. Over the following 15 months, there were over 2,000 killings. Arabs killed 236 Jews, and Jews killed 435 Arabs, whilst the police and army killed 1,200 Arabs. Throughout the rebellion, the velvet glove came off to reveal the iron fist of the British Empire. The British Army would engage in house demolitions as both a form of collective punishment and a way of sapping support for the rebels. At the beginning of the rebellion, over 200 buildings were blown up in the city of Jaffa, rendering up to 6,000 Arabs homeless. It's estimated 2,000 homes were demolished during the uprising, sometimes with entire villages being destroyed. These weren't the homes of people guilty of anything. This was a form of collective punishment. Beyond that, houses were occupied and smashed up under the cover of searching for weapons. Due to the doctrine of collective responsibility, crippling fines were imposed on innocent, already impoverished people. At other times, civilians were straight up murdered. Historian Tom Segev writes in his book, One Palestine Complete, about the Royal Engineers loading Arab men onto a bus and then forcing the driver to drive over a landmine. A witnessing police officer described seeing the scattered, mutilated bodies of the prisoners, whom the remaining villagers were then forced to bury in a pit. Other villagers were machine-gunned and set on fire. In one case, village men were rounded up and held in a pen in the May sun until they dehydrated to death. A British doctor, upon receiving reports of this incident, initially wrote, quote, "This is obviously a wild exaggeration. But where, oh where is the light conscience with which I declared, up to a year ago, that the British Army didn't do such things, and that these terrible yarns must be a complete fabrication?" End quote. Upon finding that the yarn was indeed true, the doctor wrote that, quote, The British could probably teach Hitler something he didn't know about running concentration camps." End quote. Indeed, Hitler himself actually used the persecution of the Arabs as part of his anti-British, anti-Semitic propaganda. "Palestine," he said, quote, "is having its liberty restricted by the most brutal resort to force, is being robbed of its independence, and is suffering the cruelest maltreatment for the benefit of Jewish interlopers." End quote. When Adolf Hitler is calling you cruel, you know you have problems. Chief Secretary William Battersfield both explained and justified the brutality of the British approach, writing in his diary, quote, "I doubt whether any Arab really has any ethical feeling against murder, and I am sure Arabs look upon murder as a justifiable and satisfactory weapon to use not only in private feuds, but in political controversies. We shall never get them to change their fundamental belief on this point, and so our only hope is to make murder and disturbances as unpleasant and expensive for them as possible, or, in a word, make them see that it does not pay. Then they will stop." End quote. The irony of Mr. Battehill's statement was obviously wasted on him. The British also began cooperating with Jewish militias. I'll cover the rise of these militias in a couple of episodes' time, but it's during the Arab Revolt that the Irgun begin killing civilians indiscriminately, particularly by bombing marketplaces. The rebellion was essentially crushed by 1939, after Britain was able to move 100,000 soldiers into Palestine because of the Munich Agreement with Germany. The Arab militias often acted just as badly as the British, and did not enjoy broad support from the peasants. By the end of the rebellion, more Palestinians were being killed by their fellow countrymen than by the British and Zionists combined. In January 1939, a letter from one rebel commander was published in the London Times. It stated that, quote, "Complaints are received from the villagers in the Jerusalem area regarding robbery, extortion, torture and murder committed by several people wearing the uniform of jihad. How did the innocent sin so that their money is stolen, their cattle robbed, their women raped, and their jewelry extorted? Our rebellion has become a rebellion against the villagers and not against the government or the Jews." End quote. Historian Rashid Khalidi writes about the damaging effects the rebellion had on the Palestinians, ultimately hampering their ability to resist being ethnically cleansed from their land 10 years later. He estimates that by its end, over 10% of the adult male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. This includes a high proportion of the experienced military cadres and enterprising fighters. The British also confiscated large quantities of arms and ammunition during the revolt, and continued to do so during later years. Khalidi describes these strikes as a series of self-inflicted wounds on the Arab economy, which allowed the Zionists to reinforce the separate Jewish economy. In 1925, Vladimir Jabotinsky wrote, quote, "If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and, therefore, it stands or falls on the question of armed forces." End quote. The British had acted as the benefactor, Zionism's garrison in Palestine. This is why I've opened the episode with the same clip I used in episode 6, of a GB News presenter complaining about the Palestinian protesters on Remembrance Day. There exists a willful ignorance of the history. At this moment, however, the British performed something of an about-face. They quickly came to see the Peel Commission partition plan as unworkable, and created the Woodhead Commission with the predetermined goal of concluding as much. War with Germany was looming, and now it became imperative that Britain keep the Arab and Muslim worlds on side. Britain's hold on the Muslim population of India had been tenuous during the First World War. This was now of far greater importance than a League of Nations mandate or the feelings of Jews in Palestine. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain commented that, quote, "If we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs." End quote. The British issued the White Paper of 1939, which rejected partition and called for the establishment of a Jewish national home in an independent Palestinian state within 10 years. The paper placed further restrictions on Jewish land purchases, and most crucially, it limited Jewish immigration to a total of 75,000 people over the following 5 years. After that, any further immigration would be determined by the Arab majority. The Palestinians were not inclined to believe anything the British said by this point, and rightly so. They had worked get-out clauses into the paper, but the British did restrict immigration. This came right at the time when the Nazis were about to industrialize the killing of Jews in Europe. Describing the White Paper, David Ben-Gurion wrote, quote, "A more evil, foolish, and short-sighted policy could not be imagined, and that Satan himself could not have created a more distressing and horrible nightmare." End quote. This immediately sparked a conflict between the Zionists and their British benefactors. And that's what I'll look at in 2 episodes' time. Next time, I'll examine the relationship between the Zionist movement and the Nazis in the 1930s. Thank you for listening. I've drawn on a lot of books for this episode, which I'll list in the notes. I'll just particularly mention Matthew Hughes' paper, The Banality of Brutality, British Armed Forces and the Repression of the Arab Revolt in Palestine, 1936-39. The edited and fully footnoted transcripts of the first 10 episodes of this series are now available as a book, which I'll also link to. Thank you.